Welcome back to our program, where we continue to uncover the true state of the Chinese economy behind the economic data. In 2022, despite a quarter of Chinese cities experiencing lockdowns, it is puzzling that China's announced GDP grew at a rate of 3% in the same year. Doesn't that raise doubts? The global pandemic has undeniably dealt a severe blow to China's economy. Yet the published economic data seems completely detached from the pandemic, which is logically unreasonable. We now have to raise a sensitive but necessary question. Could the data have been tampered with? In such a clearly devastated economic situation, if the Chinese government willingly manipulates the data, then have they done similar things in the past? Many experts and scholars have provided us with possible answers. However, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We are not only exploring the truth behind historical data, but also the specific methods and patterns of data manipulation by the Chinese government. So, dear viewers, we are not merely restating other people's findings here, but revealing deeper facts and stories to you. We will further explore how the Chinese government distorts and modifies data by looking beyond the surface. Let's first talk about the findings of Professor Luis Martinez from the University of Chicago. In an article published at the end of last year, he studied satellite images of 184 countries from 1992 to 2008. Correlating the brightness of nighttime lights with local economic growth, he found that the growth in nighttime lights was positively related to the level of local economic growth. However, in authoritarian countries under the same scale of an economic growth, the nighttime lights were often not as bright, and economic growth was inflated by an average of 35%. In China, this phenomenon is particularly pronounced. The country's announced economic growth data is significantly higher than the actual growth reflected by the brightness of nighttime lights. From 1992 to 2008, China's actual average annual GDP growth was only 4.9%, while the official data published by the Chinese government was 6.3% per year. Joeri Shashford, a PhD student from the University of Groningen in Netherlands, who is also a blogger for Money Macro, further expanded on Professor Martinez's research and extended the study of China's GDP to 2021. He found that compared to the 8% to 14% GDP growth rate announced by China's National Bureau of Statistics from 1992 to 2021, China's actual economic growth was only 2 to 6%, greatly exaggerated. This finding reveals that Chinese economic data may have been manipulated. According to this blogger's calculations, by 2021, China's GDP was only 40% of the official figures. In 2021, China announced a GDP figure of 114.4 trillion RMB, approximately 17.73 trillion US dollars. However, if this figure were reduced by 60%, as some studies suggest, the actual GDP might only be around 46 trillion RMB, approximately 7.09 trillion US dollars, accounting for only 30.4% of the US GDP. If we calculate based on China's officially announced 3% economic growth rate in 2022, the GDP for that year should be 47.1 trillion RMB, approximately 7.3 trillion US dollars. However, at the same time, the GDP of the United States has already reached 25.44 trillion US dollars. Clearly, China has not yet caught up with the United States in terms of economic scale. This data phenomenon raises a question. Has China created an expectation of surpassing the United States in economic size through false data? In this regard, we must pay attention to how the Chinese government handles economic data. They won't portray a bearish economy as prosperity, but they will turn severe decline into slight decline. For example, the National Bureau of Statistics announced that China's total retail sales of consumer goods in 2022 only declined by 0.2%. Is that possible? Last year, a quarter of Chinese cities experienced various degrees of lockdowns, causing many people to have no income, making it difficult for consumption to remain unaffected. Even without looking at the data, ordinary people can feel this. However, we still have some data. The 2022 Payment System Operation Report released by the People's Bank of China exposes the claims made by the National Bureau of Statistics. Card-based consumer transaction amounted to 130 trillion yuan, a year-on-year decrease of 4.28%. Mobile payments by banks reached 500 trillion yuan, down 5.19% compared to the previous year. Non-bank online payments such as Alipay and WeChat Pay amounted to 337 trillion yuan, a decrease of 4.95% year-on-year. These payment methods cover nearly 99% of consumer behavior nationwide, and it is evident from these figures that China's consumption declined by at least 5% last year rather than the modest 0.2% decrease reported by the National Bureau of Statistics. Let's now examine the export data released by the customs authorities this year. According to the customs data for January and February, China's export decreased by 6.8%. However, this seems inconsistent with the actual situation. In the first quarter of this year, both the Yangtze River Delta and the Pearl River Delta regions experienced a stagnation in export-oriented enterprises due to a lack of orders, resulting in a large number of migrant workers struggling to find employment. This situation raises doubts about the accuracy of the export data published by the customs authorities. Furthermore, when we refer to the data on the tariff reductions released by the Ministry of Finance, it further strengthens the belief that China's export decline is not merely 6.8%, and the actual situation may be more severe. According to the Ministry of Finance data for January and February of this year, China's tariffs have decreased by 27%. Typically, tariffs primarily apply to imports, while for China's export, the collected tariffs are minimal. Therefore, a 27% decrease in tariffs indicates a corresponding decrease in imports by at least 27%. Normally, we could assume that exports and imports are interconnected, and it is unlikely to see a situation where exports decline by 6.8% while imports plummet by 27%. Historical data also does not support such a scenario. Generally, if imports decline by 27%, the decline in exports would certainly exceed 20%. After understanding the pattern of how the Chinese central government handles economic data, our focus should now shift to the practice of local governments. Various cases of data falsification have been reported by the National Bureau of Statistics website, indicating widespread data falsification across different regions of China. Each time such cases are exposed, over 100 officials are removed from their position. It is worth noting that even in economic developed regions like Jiangsu province in the eastern part of China, data falsification has been observed, and their techniques of fabricating data are highly sophisticated. Take a municipality in the eastern region as an example, where it openly demands its subordinate enterprises to falsify data through social media groups. It requires each enterprise to report a main business revenue exceeding 20 million RMB in their financial statements. If the financial data falls short of 20 million RMB within a year, it must be supplemented in the last 2 months. Otherwise, the enterprise will be ineligible for future government preferential policies. So, why must the revenue reach 20 million RMB? This is because only enterprises that achieve this level of income are classified as above-scale industrial enterprises, which is the focal point of GDP statistics. These enterprises are reported separately in GDP statistics, while those with revenue below 20 million RMB are estimated collectively. Therefore, the more above-scale enterprises there are, the better the local economy appears. The local governments strive to elevate small enterprises to above-scale status to include them in GDP statistics. However, the ambitions of local governments do not stop there. They are not only coerce enterprises to falsify data, but also demand an annual growth of at least 20% in their financial reports to showcase economic growth. In a case reported by the National Bureau of Statistics, employees filling out the forms would use a pencil with the assistance of statisticians. After the statisticians confirmed the accuracy, the employees would then fill in the data with a pen and erase any pencil marks. I wonder why the Chinese government cracks down on data falsification, which seems to embellish the economic situation. The answer is closely related to fraudulent government subsidy practices. Mao Yunfei, Deputy Director of the National Bureau of Statistics of China, pointed out 2 phenomena. Officials create optimistic data to showcase their governance abilities for personal promotion, and companies falsify data to deceive the government for loans and preferential policies. For example, some chip companies may fabricate data to obtain government subsidies. Some officials may even collaborate with businesses to falsify data, allowing the companies to obtain favorable policies and loans while receiving kickbacks themselves. By doing so, officials can both gain kickbacks and have the opportunity for promotion, which is why many local officials are willing to fabricate false data. For the central government, receiving false data is equivalent to having the money taken away by these officials who report false data, and these fraudulent officials can also get promoted. This infuriates the Communist Party. With less money in the hands of the party nowadays, they can no longer turn a blind eye to such behavior. Therefore, in recent years, there has been a strict crackdown on data falsification. Example was publicly disclosed on the official website of the National Bureau of Statistics. Zhang Jinhua, a deputy provincial level leader in Jiangsu province, had his party membership and public office revoked due to manipulating economic data. It was the first time in the history of the Chinese Communist Party that a provincial level official position was revoked due to economic data falsification. During his tenure in Zhenjiang City, although Zhang actively promoted urban development, he caused the city's debt to soar to 400 billion RMB, with annual interest payments reaching hundreds of billions. Zhenjiang City's annual tax revenue was only 30 billion, so it can be said that he pushed Zhenjiang to the brink of bankruptcy. However, because he presented Zhenjiang's economy very well on paper, he was promoted to the position of the party secretary of Nanjing City. During his tenure in Nanjing, Zhang Jinhua again fabricated false economic data. Under his leadership, Nanjing's GDP in the first half of 2020 surpassed Tianjin, entering the top 10 cities in China. In the second and third quarter of 2020, as well as the first quarter of 2021, Nanjing's GDP even surpassed that of Wuhan. It's worth noting that Wuhan is an important industrial city in China, home to major enterprises such as semiconductor giant Yangtze Memory Technologies, automaker Dongfeng Motor Corporation, Wuhan Iron and Steel, and China Three Gorges Corporation. How could Nanjing, a political center with less economic activity, suddenly surpass Wuhan? However, Zhang Jinhua was once again promoted due to his outstanding economic performance in Nanjing, becoming a deputy provincial level leader in Jiangsu province, ascending 2 levels solely based on falsified data. In this situation, many officials naturally choose to fabricate false data in order to seek promotion. To address this issue, the Chinese government has implemented strict measures to crack down on data falsification. However, have local governments started to comply? In theory, the answer should be yes, because the binding force of the law and severe punishment measures should deter those who attempt to manipulate data. However, the reality is different, because there is a saying in China, policies from above are met with countermeasures from below. As a result, the decision of the central government often do not receive full implementation at the local level. Therefore, even though the central government is making efforts to combat data falsification, there are still instances of falsification at the local level. According to reports, a township-level official from a northern province in China admitted to journalists that he had participated in a meeting chaired by a deputy county mayor. In the first meeting, the deputy county mayor explicitly instructed all townships to meet their own economic targets, implying the need to falsify data to meet the economic targets set by the county. However, after the township officials completed the data, the same deputy county mayor organized another meeting to prevent data falsification. In this meeting, the deputy county mayor warned the township officials that the data must be accurate according to the requirements of superiors and no falsification is allowed. Faced with contradictory instructions in the 2 meetings, the participants were at a loss and did not know what to do. The previous meeting clearly required them to create false data because the superiors demanded that the economy must meet the targets, while the latter meeting emphasized that data falsification is not allowed because the superiors require accurate data. Now, all officials were confused whether the data should be filled accurately or inaccurately. Regarding the issue of data falsification in China's economic statistics, especially GDP data, it appears quite unusual for the Western world. However, some mainstream economists have provided explanations. For example, Michael Pettis, a finance professor at Peking University, Guanghua School of Management, gave a metaphor. In the West, a construction company spends $100 to dig a hole and then another $100 to fill it, resulting in a $200 expenditure with no profit. In China, a construction company also spends $100 to dig a hole and another $100 to fill it. However, in China, this is defined as creating an asset worth $200. This also means that China's official GDP data deviates significantly from the actual economic situation. However, the importance of GDP data goes beyond the accuracy of economic statistics. If China's GDP data is actually overestimated, then China's debt levels may be even higher, and the debt-driven real estate bubble may be more severe than expected. By the end of this year, China's national debt is expected to reach 26 trillion yuan. Local government debt is 35 trillion yuan, and urban investment debt is 65 trillion yuan, resulting in a debt-to-GDP ratio of 267%. In comparison, data released by the International Monetary Fund shows that China's debt-to-GDP ratio is 268.8%. Significantly higher than the average of 200% for emerging market countries. This also suggests that China's local governments may face operational difficulties. At the same time, the ratio of China's housing market value to GDP is also increasing, indicating an increase in the Chinese real estate bubble. In 2020, China's housing market value was 62 trillion compared to 34 trillion for the United States. 10 trillion for Japan, and a combined total of 31 trillion for the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. China's housing market value is double the sum of these three European countries. By comparing the value of housing market to GDP, we can have a more intuitive understanding of the extent of the real estate market bubble. The ratio is 148% for the United States, 233 for Japan, 271 for Germany, and 339 for the United Kingdom. China, on the other hand, reaches an astonishing 882%, much higher than the largest bubble among European and American countries, which is in the United Kingdom. This further indicates that the real estate market bubble in China may be the most vulnerable to bursting. In general, the issue of the authenticity of China's economic data is a topic worth attention because it not only involves the credibility of the data, but also could have a significant impact on China's debt level and the real estate market, which in turn may have profound effects on the global economic situation.